Hello and welcome to the Power Pod. I'm your host, Matthew Cohen, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming back onto the show Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and former IDF spokesman, Jonathan Conricus. Jonathan, thank you very much for joining me. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm well and blessed speaking to you from Israel in my free and native home country. So a lot of things to be grateful about.
For sure, of course. And I'm glad that at the moment you have a little bit of quiet, which of course brings me to my first question. So we know a lot can change in the region, but at the time of recording this video, we see the Iran-US-Israel ceasefire still in effect. And we know that in recent days, the Trump administration looked to implement Project Freedom. However, we did see a few missile exchanges between the US and Iranian forces. And while this all goes on, I've noticed in South Africa, where I currently am, but also with other diaspora communities, how there seems to be a sense of frustration. I think a lot of people are feeling the effects of the rising fuel prices, the economic consequences of the war. And so I hear a lot of people all around the world really saying, well, we're a bit tired of this. What does this war have to do with us? Can they not just end it and call it quits and let's get the economy back on track? And so to people who may be listening to this and be feeling that way, why would you say that it is important that people care about the Iran war?
Well, it's not so much that they should care about the Iran war. It's that, in my opinion, people should want to defeat a theocratical regime that is hell-bent on achieving nuclear weapons. That, I think, is a concern that people in free countries, people who like freedom, people who like, the sanctity of human life and who are against oppression, who are against terrorism, they should care not about the war. The war is just the means. What they should care is that the Iranian regime is defeated. Now, if we take things into a little bit of a bigger perspective here, what we have is a regime, the Iranian regime, that is being exposed as extremely radical with absolutely no respect for anything, not the lives of their own people, the Iranian people, not the lives of the citizens and civilians of their neighboring Muslim countries, whether it's the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Qataris, the Saudis, Jordanians, Kuwaitis, and of course not Israelis. And they have absolutely no respect for norms, regulations, international law, and established practices. As they're basically a rogue nation, they're lashing out and they're doing things in terms of the Hormuz Strait and in terms of what the missiles and drones that they're firing that really should be all of the evidence that people around the world need in order to understand why it is so imperative that this regime doesn't possess any meaningful weapons, any weapons of mass destruction, and definitely not nuclear weapons. And in that sense, the current war that was fought and is still ongoing on a temporary ceasefire between the US, Israel, and Iran is, I think, a very important global mission. Now, yes, prices have gone up. I don't know the situation in South Africa, but in the US, they've gone up by 25, 30% at the pump. And maybe in other places, they've gone up more. And I think we're going to feel additional consequences of the war in terms of fertilizers, influence on various agricultural crops and how that will influence the world. And if we were speaking from India or Japan or maybe even China or the Philippines, we may have been feeling the consequences of the Hormuz Strait being blocked by the Iranians even more. Having said that, with the current inconvenience, which a lot of people are feeling around the world, I think it is dwarfed in comparison to what could have been in the future if this Iranian regime would have been allowed to continue to exist, go unchecked, and to continue to develop nuclear weapons and more and longer range ballistic missiles. Currently, they have a range of about 4,000 kilometers, which I believe puts South Africa just outside of the range. But most of Europe, almost all of Europe, including parts of Northern Europe, is within Islamic regime ballistic missile range. And so is, of course, the entire Middle East, including the western parts of India. So we're talking about a nation that is led by a bunch of crazy, unhinged, theocratic dictators, which they're trying to get their hands on weapons of mass destruction. And what President Trump or what the US and Israel did was to stop that from happening in the foreseeable future. And as much as I would want, things to go back to normal, for Israelis to be able to focus their capabilities and their talents and energy on building and creating, not on fighting. Sadly, I think it's a necessity that we have here, whereby we have a rare opportunity to really change the trajectory of the Middle East for the better. And that's the emphasis here. What I agree with, people around the world who may have this sentiment of, get it over with. Maybe this wasn't communicated well enough to people. And I think there's been a real challenge here for the US and for Israel to pierce through international media. There are very thick, very meaningful, strong, one-directional membranes or filters in international media, where you could see a perverse situation that a lot of Iranian state propaganda is actually parroted in Western media. And that helps create this kind of battle fatigue and false sense of achievement for the Iranians, and battle fatigue on the civilian side in the West and in the US. And this is something that the US and Israel, the Trump administration and Israel, should have done better to pierce through and to communicate and to shape the media environment to inform people what it really is that we're fighting, what is in store, how long it will take, and what the consequences would be. And this is a very important part, what the consequences would be if we don't take action. There's a price for action, but there's also a very big, steep, and dangerous price for inaction. And we can look back at history, we can look back, revisit the times of the Second World War, look at different policies of appeasement, what they led to, the fact that the Nazi regime was allowed to build its capabilities, to annex one country after the other, and many countries thought that they could appease that crazy regime by giving them Sudetenland and by allowing Austria to be taken. But then at the end, that never really satisfied the appetite. It's exactly the same thing with the Iranian regime, and that is why I'm saying that, yes, people are paying a price. It's discomfort, but let's put things into perspective. This is a far lower price to be paid from an international economic point of view and a civilian point of view than what we would have had to face had the Iranian regime been able to actually implement their goals, to have nuclear weapons and longer range ballistic missiles.
Right. And I think you mention a very important point, Jonathan, when you speak about the media landscape, because as you rightfully mentioned, it seems that a lot of people, well, firstly, they don't understand the nature of the war. They don't understand how long it will take. And I think you're right in terms of perhaps the US and Israel could have maybe done a better job at showing people, look, we're achieving all of these things, but so much of the media seems to listen to the Iranian regime and take their word as gospel, as we've seen with the likes of Hamas and Hezbollah, which, I mean, are all proxies of the Iranian regime. But speaking of the current situation, so as explained before, we've seen the blockade, the US blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, and we've seen this situation for weeks now where there seems to be these back and forth negotiations between the Trump administration and the Iranian government, or what's left of the Iranian government.
Yeah.
And so what I'd like to ask you is, there are a lot of people who seem to be of the opinion, well, maybe this is ineffective, we've got to go back to fighting. There are others who say, no, we need to reach a deal. There are others who say, maybe having this blockade and sort of starving the regime of their resources is the right move. So I'd like to know, in your opinion, based on your military understanding and expertise, does this seem like the right strategy at the moment?
Yeah, so currently where we are is that the U.S. Gave the American administration provided the Iranian regime with a proposal for a deal that would bring a ceasefire and a possible long-term ceasefire and an actual end to the war. It included, the first condition was no enrichment on Iranian soil, and that all of the previously enriched uranium up to military level, which the Iranians did in violation of international agreements, that all of the enriched material be extracted safely from Iran, and that Iran commits to not trying to develop nuclear weapons and to a strict system of international inspections and to open the Strait of Hormuz. Those were the core conditions, which from my perspective, from an Israeli perspective, is far less than what's really necessary. But this was the American proposal. The Iranians got that about a week ago. They thought about it, and yesterday they returned an official answer, which was basically no, that they're not going to agree not to pursue nuclear weapons. And that should tell everybody around the world, those are for freedom and those are who are against freedom, where the Iranian regime really stands. They stand and they want to prioritize enrichment in order to develop nuclear weapons. That is what it boils down to. And they've been, their communications from official sources in Iran have been very belligerent and enticing, really insulting to President Trump, but specifically kind of warmongering. And it appears that the Iranians, the people who are currently in power in Iran, which is mostly a group of IRGC generals that appear to be making decisions, they're taking the Iranian regime on a very, it's a lot of brinkmanship. It's not very smart diplomacy, and they're making dangerous decisions. But what they've said basically to the U.S. through the Pakistani negotiators is no, we're not going to agree to a deal. So at this time, where we are now, is a fork in the road. We may very likely go back to kinetic operations, to violence, go back to active hostilities, because there's no active negotiations, and the Iranians said no. And depending on what President Trump and his team decides, we may continue to extend the ceasefire for whatever obscure reason, which I wouldn't be able to comprehend why. And currently, what we have on the ground from a military perspective is that all of the tools are there. The U.S. forces are still deployed in the area. Actually, more forces, more capabilities in terms of air power, intel, logistics, naval power have been arriving in the region of the Arabian Gulf and the Middle East during the ceasefire. So there's more military capabilities at hand. And what's happening every day is through the quite effective American blockade on Iranian ports. We have a situation whereby the Iranian regime loses at least, and these are conservative assessments, at least $500 million every day in revenue lost, since they're not able to sell oil in violation of sanctions, but nevertheless sell oil as they used to do before the war started. And that is money that the Iranian regime doesn't have. And there are quite a lot of difficulties now for the Iranian regime. Thanks to the American blockade, they cannot export, they cannot import any big items of bulk that would be transferred by sea. The Iranian economy absolutely relies something to the tune of 85 to 90% on oil exports and petrochemicals. Since that is prevented by the American blockade, the Iranian regime has a serious issue of access to international funds. Another interesting point that finally happened, after relentless, unprecedented Iranian attacks against the United Arab Emirates, a Muslim neighboring country, a small country just on the other side of the Persian Gulf, a few hundred miles or kilometers away from Iran, that country has been targeted by Iran more than any other country, more than Israel, more than US bases. The Iranian regime has struck the UAE with thousands of drones and missiles. And what the Emiratis finally did was to use what probably is their doomsday weapon against the Iranians, and that is to freeze several dozen billions of dollars of Iranian money that was active in Emirati financial institutions, because the Emiratis were basically a financial hub for the Iranians to access the global markets. Again, in violation of international sanctions, and I think the Emiratis shouldn't have been doing it to begin with. They were, which is unfortunate, but now the Emiratis have retaliated against Iranian military aggression by freezing their funds, which is interesting and is very meaningful, because the Iranian regime doesn't really have any foreign currency reserves left, and they're very limited in their ability to access markets. They are now unable to export oil, so there's no money coming in. And every day that goes by, as you alluded to in the beginning, yes, people around the world are feeling the discomfort of gas prices going up, and I think there are still a few more effects that we will face, but the discomfort or the suffering that the Iranian regime is going through is far, far greater. There's no comparison. And here's why it's so absurd. What people around the world who are not into the details, what they're seeing in the media is that Iran, there's a lot of bluster, there's a lot of bravado, lots of macho messaging coming out of, a lot of hard talk coming out of Iran, but in reality, they're suffering, and every day that goes by brings them closer to economic collapse. So what I think needs to be done is to maintain and enhance the economic pressure on the regime, to get ready to use military force again, to communicate to the Iranian regime that this is now your last chance. You said no to a very reasonable deal that President Trump laid forward through the Pakistani negotiators. We'll give you 48 hours, and then we're going to resume military activity. Now, an important other part for people really to understand what this Iranian regime is and actually how out of bounds they are. Not only have they strangled the Hormuz Strait, which is the cause of the spike in oil prices and everything that we're dealing with. Not only have they violated international law of free shipping and free passage, something that is sacred around the world. There are many straits like the Hormuz Strait where neighboring countries could, if there wasn't respect for international law, they could do the same things that Iran is doing today. There's the Malacca Straits in Singapore. There's the Suez Canal. There's Gibraltar. There's Panama. There are many other locations where there's vast volume of international shipping, where there are countries who could inflict damage on it. But that's not done because of international law and how that is respected. The Iranian regime has shown its disrespect for that, but they're also taking it one step further. Not only have they stopped international maritime shipping, nothing to do with Iran, nothing to do with the war. Indian, Chinese, Japanese, European, Qatari, all of those vessels who are not part of the fighting have been stopped by the Iranians, and that's old news. What the Iranian regime is insinuating now is that they also want to take control over underwater information and communication cables. And they actually issued official statements by the official Iranian news agency, IRNA, a few days ago, where they provided an infographic showing here's where the cables are. This is where a lot of the seabed cables, international high-speed, high-volume communication cables are. And what the Iranian regime feels entitled to do is to take control over these cables and to tax countries and institutions around the world, financial institutions who rely on the information that is provided in these cables, and even more important, to force those institutions to comply with Iranian law, which is absurd, which is a nation going rogue. It's some military junta regime that is just crazy, making crazy statements. But the thing is that they may think that they're entitled to do so, and they may actually try. The only good thing is that the Iranian Navy hasn't been seen since, for a few weeks ago when the American forces in CENTCOM destroyed most of it. So they may have submarines left, a few of them. They may be able to do some damage, but, in terms of a sustained campaign against international communications would be difficult for them. But it really tells you what the Iranian regime is about, and actually how desperate and lawless and unhinged that regime is.
Of course. And I think overall you've given us a very good holistic overview of, well, firstly, the strategy that's going on, and secondly, the threat that this regime, which really is just a rogue regime, as you've alluded to, poses to the world. But I think there's just one aspect that we haven't covered on the Iranian front, which is the prospect of regime change. So as we speak about the ongoing strategy in the war, and of course the sort of starvation of the Iranian economy, do you believe that there could be some sort of a strategy aimed at an actual regime change where the people take to the streets again, as we saw in January?
Yeah, I believe that will eventually happen. I believe that the very brave, courageous, and suffering Iranian people, who, by the way, have been without internet access for more than 70 days by the Iranian regime. There's a complete internet blackout. The only people who have access to internet are, no surprise, regime spokespeople and regime politicians. But the ordinary civilian in Iran doesn't have internet. And that, by the way, is a very big self-inflicted wound by the Iranian regime, because that hurts the economy greatly. They're suffering anyhow, but the fact that they're cutting their own communications makes it very difficult to trade. Most of the Iranian market is a modern market that relies on internet and strategic communications. By cutting it, the regime is basically saying, I'm going to make it increasingly difficult for people to earn a livelihood, for commerce to be conducted, and for tax revenue to be generated. But I'm doing that because my number one priority is to remain in control and to stifle dissent, and not to allow people to voice their opinion, and for information to come out of Iran, and for people to say what really is going on Iranian streets and in Iranian cities. And I think that shows exactly, again, the priorities of the regime, not the benefit of the Iranian people, and just oppression and brutality. We do get continued information coming out once in a while from brave Iranians who are able to circumvent the blockage of information, where we get news of executions, of young Iranians being executed by the regime after they participated in protests against the regime, after they said something or did something minor to voice their frustration with the regime. They're apprehended, tortured, fake confessions, and eventually hanged, summarily hanged, and executed by the regime. And there are multiple stories out there. Of course, they don't get a lot of coverage in most of Western media. You don't see a lot of stories in the New York Times or CNN or the Washington Post or the Guardian or many other places. And probably, I haven't looked, not reflected in South African media. But I'll tell you that the Iranian people are suffering. And at the spiritual, strategic level, eventually evil will fail. Eventually good forces will come to the fore, and they will win, and they will take back control of Iran. I believe in that. I believe that the Iranian regime is evil. I believe that it is corrupt. I believe that it mismanages the resources of the very bountiful and blessed nation of Iran, oil, gas, many other resources. And I believe that the Iranian people knows this and want to stand up against the regime. What it currently boils down to is the ability to do so. And in January, the Iranian people took to the streets by the tens of millions of them, bravely chanting, "We want a different future. We don't want to send our money to Gaza and to Lebanon. We don't want Hezbollah and Hamas to be the beneficiaries of our taxpayer money. We want Iran to be strong, free, prosperous, and we want a different future for our children." So not necessarily a love letter to the West or to Israel, just a urge of ordinary Iranians to have a different and better life of freedom, of prospects about the future. The sad thing was, as we all saw, was that these Iranians were gunned down by the regime brutally, including by foreign mercenaries that the regime brought in, and they basically just mowed them down with machine guns and sniper fire on Iranian streets, and that was the temporary end of that uprising in January. What's happened since then, and this is a key point, is that I think a lot of people, a lot of opposition people in Iran have been equipped with the means to make a difference. And I think that what we will see in the coming future is Iranians taking to the streets, but doing so in a more organized fashion and not with their bare hands against a very cruel and oppressive regime that is equipped with machine guns and thugs that are willing to use them against unarmed civilians. So I think that's going to be the big difference. I think the Iranian people is the X factor in this equation that most international pundits and people who hate Trump, who hate Netanyahu, who despise Israel, and therefore they're against the war, even though I think bringing down the Iranian regime should be a universally acknowledged goal. But a lot of people who claim to be champions of human rights and criticize Israel about many things, they're very silent on the oppression and the brutality of the Iranian regime. And they don't seem to be prioritizing the civil rights and human rights of the Iranian people. But I think that the Iranian people eventually will rise up. It will surprise the Iranian regime, and that we will see a different future in the Middle East, a future without the Iranian regime, a much better and prosperous one. But I think that we still have some time to go. And, just to be fair and to level expectations here, I think it'll be a challenging period. I don't think that we have any good examples in history except for the change of power in Czechoslovakia, the demise of the Soviet Union there, which was essentially peaceful, no large-scale violence. That's perhaps the only example in recent history where a totalitarian regime was overthrown by the people and they transitioned to democracy without significant bloodbath. But most other cases, there are sacrifices to be made in order to take back control of a country by a people against an oppressive regime. So I think we should anticipate that it won't be smooth sailing, but whatever the price is, I think freedom for the Iranian people from this foreign oppression, from this external extremists that have taken control over Iran, the religious regime, that is a very, very noble cause. And I think that the US and Israel will help the Iranian people with the tools and the means necessary in order to eventually get that done. I think we have a problem. Final note, I think we have a problem with correctly stating goals by the US and by Israel, and there's been ambiguity and lack of clarity in the US and Israel as to whether the goal is or isn't to get rid of the regime. And I think that Israel and the US should be saying it loudly, clearly, and proudly. Yes, this Iranian regime is an abomination. It oppresses the Iranian people. It is a violator, it's a systemic violator of human rights in Iran, and it's a reason or a source of instability in the region. It exports violence and extremism. It supports terror organizations all around the Middle East and in some other parts of the world, and therefore we will fight it until the Iranian people are able to take back control of the country. And that's something that hasn't been said in these clear words by any of the leaders. I could only add, it's sad to see the state of lack of leadership in Europe and around the so-called free world. A lot of democracies seem to be anything but free. They do not seem to be free from fear or free from Islamist oppression. And when I look at, how European democracies have responded to the situation in Iran, shameful. How they have just, let the Iranian people continue to suffer at the hands of a very brutal regime. And still, a lot of European countries think of themselves as champions of democracy and freedom and civil rights. Far from the case. This was a great opportunity to do something meaningful. And up until now, most democracies have failed.
Right. And I think that was actually something that was also pointed out by Reza Pahlavi, the exiled Crown Prince of Iran. I remember he actually had a video a few days ago speaking about the sort of European failure to actually acknowledge what's important here. Jonathan,
he said very clearly. He said very clearly. I mean, he was in a press conference with 150 journalists from Europe and from around the world, and they asked him dozens of questions. Not a single question by any of these democratic countries, the press in those democratic countries, pertain to the suffering of the Iranian people. There was a lot of question about oil prices and what will he do if he goes to power, and how reckless is the moves by President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and many other things. Just one, small detail of 93 million people suffering under a brutal, oppressive regime. Not newsworthy, not fit to print, not interesting for most international media organizations. And that tells you a lot about the reality.
It certainly does. It really does. Jonathan, I have one final question for you, shifting to specifically the Israel-Gaza front. So the Hague Group, which happens to be co-chaired by South Africa, they've been looking to punish Israel specifically on the legal front. But they actually came under quite a lot of scandal in recent days. It was found out that actually one of their senior members leaked it, that they've actually been coordinating with Al-Haq, which is a US-sanctioned group with terror ties. So I'm curious to know, in your assessment, do you believe that this could have an impact on the Hague Group's ability to harm Israel? And I think beyond that, will this have any sort of implications on the ICJ case? Because, of course, that is a court case. The Hague Group's not directly involved in that, but I always wonder if these lobby groups can exercise external pressure on these sorts of things.
Yeah, there's a whole ecosystem of tainted organizations that appear to be humanitarian organizations, NGOs, civil rights organizations, international law organizations. The Hague Group is one of them, Al-Haq, El Samidun. There are many organizations that have this cloak or veneer of prestigious, positive, rights-oriented organizations. But once you just scratch the surface very gently, you find out that it is really a cesspool of Islamists, of left-wing extremists and conspiracists, and people that are driven not by a love for human rights and international law, but by a burning hatred against Jews, against Israel, hatred against the internationally established order, the Western-dominated order, and also, I would say, against Judeo-Christian values and civilization. And I can give you a long list of organizations that still, unfortunately, to this day, enjoy the respectability and legitimacy through fancy names and, a few Western, Islamist poster boys and fronts, but behind the scenes what you have is a global network of Islamist organizations that are operating using lawfare against the State of Israel, using international fora like the ICJ, the ICC, and other institutions, UN institutions as well, in order to fight against Israel. Long story short, they too shall fail. Just like Arab nations who tried to attack Israel in 48, 56, 67, 73 and onwards have failed, bitter failure at trying to destroy the State of Israel on the battlefield, just as terror organizations like Hezbollah, the PLO, Fatah, and the Islamic Jihad have failed in their quest to defeat Israel, so too shall these organizations like you mentioned the Hague Group, and there are many, many others, unfortunately, some of them funded by taxpayers' money in the West, which makes it even more absurd. But the bottom line here is I think that every day that goes by, another piece of the facade of the international lawfare against Israel it falls, and it exposes the naked truth. The prosecutor Karim Khan of the ICJ is a man who was involved in a sex scandal. There are very severe allegations against him, who, according to recently exposed documents and testimonies, was told by the Qatari authorities that if he pursues and presses charges against the Israeli Prime Minister and former Defense Minister for war crimes, he would be, quote, taken care of by the Qataris. And he would get out of his legal trouble. There are serious allegations that he sexually assaulted a subordinate co-worker at the ICJ. That in itself should tell people around the world what exactly Israel is dealing with. But it's limiting for Israel. It's a nuisance. It's a strategic problem for Israel. But let me tell people who are, listening, and if they're, have this gloomy sense about the future and that the world is closing in on Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, not going to happen. Israel is strong, vibrant, self-confident, knows that it stands on solid legal ground in its actions to defend itself, in its actions to defeat its enemies, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, the Iranian regime, or whoever else is attacking Israel. And even though it's a tough time to be Israeli, it's a tough time for Israeli financial institutions and for the Israeli state, we are pushing through. And these attempts to discriminate, delegitimize, ostracize, boycott, and sanction Israel by organizations like the ones you mentioned, they are important. We're fighting it. They will fail, and Israel will win.
Right. Jonathan, thanks very much for joining me today. For those who enjoyed hearing what you have to say and would like to see more of your work, where can they follow you?
They can just Google my name on YouTube. I have my YouTube channel where all of my media appearances are. It's Jonathan Conricus Official. I'm on X under J Conricus, on Instagram and Facebook as well under the same handle, J Conricus. And I try to publish the content and interviews that I do, and a few monologues and op-eds, and of course a senior fellow at FDD, at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is ftd.org. And everything that my very smart colleagues write appears there, and I have a few minor contributions there as well.
Perfect. Jonathan, thanks very much for taking the time to chat with me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Matthew. Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for tuning into this episode. If you enjoyed it, please remember to follow Jonathan on the platforms that he mentioned, and also subscribe to this channel for more content such as this. Until next time, I'm Matthew Cohen, and this is the Power Pod.